Hello, everyone. Welcome to Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, Empowering Refugees for Addressing Power Dynamics and Refugee Assistance. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugee spiritual sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Just as a reminder for everyone who's joining us today, there is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be a time at the end of our webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please raise your hands through the control panel or submit a question through the questions box and we will be able to assist you. Additionally, the presentation and any resources, a recording of today's webinar will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And that brings us to our presenter for today, Emily Griffiths, who is Community Sponsorship Specialist with IS. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll give it to you from here.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, like Joyce said, I work at HISE as a community sponsorship specialist. So I work with volunteer coordinators and community sponsorship coordinators. But before that, I was a volunteer coordinator. So I worked a lot with volunteers and as well as with case managers, talking about some of these dynamics that we can have with refugees and with each other. So yeah, really excited to kind of share that with all of you today. So just to give an overview of what we're looking at today and what we're talking about is we're going to reflect on certain terms that you may or may not have heard before, like equity, privilege, intersectionality. We're going to understand how trauma can lead refugees to feel disempowered and how that interacts with our power dynamics. And then we're going to learn some of those practical tools that you can use leaving this webinar, right? So you can understand the terms and kind of know the knowledge, but then how do we put it into practice? Because it can really seem kind of broad and vague when we talk about it kind of theoretically. So we want to make sure that you leave today with some good tools in your belt when you do work with refugees in the future. So again, even more terms we're going to learn is also white saviorism. We're going to talk about systemic oppression, and then we're going to understand how to be aware of those power dynamics when working with refugee populations to ensure we are causing the least harm possible, right? And I just want a disclaimer before we kind of dive into some of these things, that hearing the word privilege, addressing our own privilege and power that we have in these dynamics may feel really uncomfortable, especially since we're all here, and I'm assuming you're all here because you want to help and uplift the refugees you're working with. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. But working with vulnerable populations is not intuitive, right? Some of you may be working with refugees for the first time, working with a vulnerable population for the first time. And even if it's not your first time and you've had a lot of practice, there's so much we can learn, right? Whether you have a master's or doctorate in psychology or social work or any of these topics that kind of touch on these things, there's still so much to learn, right? There's a lot of learning we can do about our own privileges and biases, and it's a journey, it's not a destination. So the goal of today's webinar is to not make you an expert so that you never make a mistake again or never have to think about your privilege again, but really it's just to make sure that we can be aware of these things as they come up so that we can show up as our best selves. So I just want to preface that this is not about perfection, it's just about increasing our knowledge and learning. Okay, so again, the key concepts that we're going to go over: equity, privilege, white saviorism, and intersectionality. We're going to go through each one. So here's a graphic I like to show, and you may have seen it before in trainings, you may have not, and there's a lot of terms here, but in reality, so this is what society kind of looks like. We see this graphic of people who are different heights. You can imagine that as, this is to give like a practical example, but you can imagine that as people who have different amounts of money when they were born, whether they had earned it or not. They had this generational wealth. You can assume that maybe it's someone who's lived in this country before versus not. So there's a lot of different ways you could imagine it, but here it's based off height just to make it easier to understand. So in reality, there's this 1% that has so much more than the middle class or lower class, right? They're getting much more than they need, and there's a huge disparity. We talk about this a lot just in our general conversations about this huge disparity we see across America, and it also happens in other countries as well. Some people talk about this goal as equality. And even before I saw this graphic, I would say, yeah, equality is the goal, right? But what equality really means is that everyone is going to benefit from the same support. And when you look at the graphic, not everyone benefits from the same support, right? One person doesn't need the box to look over the fence, one it's appropriate for, and the other has the box, it still doesn't help them see over the fence. Equity is where everyone gets the support they need versus everyone benefiting from the same support. So that produces equity, right? The person who's tall enough can see over the fence, the person who needs the one box gets it, and the person who needs a little bit of extra support gets that extra support. So we see that sometimes with policies, right? We see that with affirmative action, we see that with welfare policies that help individuals kind of get to this equal level and equal footing to everyone else. And a kind of new adoption is this idea of justice, right? That we've removed the fence entirely. And what the fence means theoretically is some sort of systemic barrier, whether that's racism, ableism, sexism, and that we didn't have to deal with that in the first place, right? That's our ideal. Will we ever get there? It's probably going to take a very, very long time, right? But we always work to try and get to that level of justice, right? Removing those inequities. Next slide, thanks. So that's equity. White saviorism emphasizes inequalities and inequities, right? So white savior complex is a term that you may or may not have heard before, again, and it might be thrown around a lot in media, but really what it is to describe a white person who considers themselves like this helper to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but they're helping for the wrong reasons. Not always consciously, and in fact, it's almost never consciously. It's usually not with a bad intention, good intentions kind of gone awry, right? But they end up doing a little bit more to hurt than help. You might hear about this a lot when people go across seas to help children of people of color, or they go on these missionary trips or these service trips and end up not really listening to the community, and also assuming that the person there wouldn't be able to be resilient without their help. And the idea of these white figures need them to come and rescue them, or they would be helpless. And it really ignores the experiences and preferences of those they're helping. So this is going to be centered, and this should be kind of like a main thought going through some of these things of, am I including the experiences and the preferences of the refugees I'm working with and their culture, right? Instead of infringing my ideas and my opinions as the right way. Next slide, thanks. So we've gone over equity, white saviorism, intersectionality, essentially how our characteristics, the things that make us us, our qualities, impact how systems and the community interacts with us. So it's a little small, but you should be able to read the different things on this wheel. The things in the middle are like things that we can't change really, or that are pretty fixed within us, right? Our race, ethnicity, our sexual orientation, our age, and everything around there is more kind of on the outside, things that we can or may be able to change as time goes on, right? So your religion, your education, parental status, so all these things. And what, I want you all to think about or reflect on is, have you ever received better or worse treatment depending on any of these characteristics, right? Are there any categories you've never had to think about before? And are there categories that might impact how refugees are perceived in society? And what biases could they experience? Some examples I've heard people say is, oh, I'm not a parent. And when it comes to asking for vacation or time off during the holidays, people who are parents get preference versus me, right? Maybe they have their own family back at home with their mom or dad, but they don't have children. And sometimes their supervisors will preference the vacations of those who have children, right? Some people have used the fact of being a female, and when a police stops you, you don't maybe get the same treatment. He might be a little bit nicer to you, right? If you're a white female in the car, and let you go, right? I've used that example a few times, whereas some people have had really negative experiences, or, you know, like my dad, for example, has always had to pay his ticket, right? Because he's a white male. And things could be very different depending on your race, your gender, any sort of characteristics, make these things either safer or much more dangerous for you, or just uncomfortable. So there's different levels of what these different categories can do for you. And in some of these categories, you may be privileged. And in some categories, you might be at a disadvantage, right? So that is true for everyone. There's going to be categories here that you've never had to think about because it's never impacted you. It's never had a negative effect on you. And there are ones that you think about a lot because they do impact you. But it's important to remember the ones that you don't have to think about. And if there's something here that you're like, I've never had to think about that, it's never caused me a problem, it might cause a problem for someone who's a refugee coming into this country. What does it mean to be an immigrant? What kind of privileges do we have? Because you might have been born here or had family here and have gotten used to the system where now you're in a position to help refugees. So we're going to point out some examples of privileges that we have that a refugee family may not have, and things that maybe we take for granted, but it's important to remember it when working with refugees. And again, this may not apply to you. Some of you may be immigrants. Some of you may have arrived here 3, 4, 5 years ago, but just is an idea of thinking through these things, and you can think through your own privileges as well. So the dominant language of the area you live in being your native language. That is not true for many of our refugees who come here, that they are not coming here with the native language in their back pocket. Now, this may or may not be true for you, right? Generationally, your family has grown up in the United States and understands the systems and laws. We know that refugees have to go through cultural orientation just to understand United States education systems, medical systems, insurance, right? All these things are different here. And on top of that, they're also looking for a job, trying to make sure their family's okay, find the grocery store, right? And they're also trying to interpolate all these jobs and all these systems we have. Generational wealth being passed down. So if you've had family in the country for a while, they might have been able to buy assets like homes, had savings, and can pass it down to their children, right? Or pass it down to their siblings, whoever their beneficiary is. Being able to stay in the country with the food, customs, and traditions we feel comfortable with, right? We know what Halloween is. We all have a certain way of celebrating those things, generally. Maybe not for you. We understand the food here, right? When you travel, you might get a stomach ache because you move somewhere and you have to adjust to all these different spices and foods. And you start to get homesick a little bit. Even if it's just a week vacation or you're out of the country for a little bit, you might start to crave those things. It's very difficult when someone has to then come here and have to adapt. And having our family and friends nearby, right? That's definitely something that we might take for granted, right? That we have a community or a system here that we can call on when we need help, regardless of what that is, for a job, for our schooling. You have someone to kind of reach out to. If you need them to look after your kids, you have an idea of who to go to for some of these needs. And kind of tangential to that is social capital. Social capital is this idea that we have this network, right? You might have gone to school and made connections with teachers who then introduced you to other individuals. You've had friends, your parents, the friends of your parents. Like all of these connections, these tangential little connections are social capital. So you might know someone in the real estate business and you want to get in there. When refugees come here, they don't have those things, right? Maybe they don't have their family and friends, but they again don't have social capital, which is a main way people receive jobs, they learn of opportunities, they learn about activities around them. So that's a very theoretical concept, but very real in our day-to-day life. And you've probably heard that term before, and the phrase that it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? And refugees come here really not knowing many individuals. Great. And this is a quote I just want to reference here. Is similar to the discomfort we feel when having to admit something's wrong. There's a very large amount of discomfort for people around admitting when they have privilege, especially when that privilege comes from things they can't control. Right, so there's a lot of things that you might have looked at on that circle, or even when I was just talking out loud, these privileges that we have, might have felt uncomfortable, like, well, I can't control those things. I just had them. But that's exactly what privilege is, right? It's nothing to feel bad about. It's just something to notice when we're working with refugees. And they're things, again, you cannot control. It's not your fault that you have these privileges. It's just good to be aware so that you can be aware of what other people might be lacking. Okay, we can just click through all these bullet points. So again, this is the opposite of what, maybe what we experience here and then how refugees experience. They're not able to communicate with those around them. They have to learn and adapt to an entirely different country's laws, customs, gender norms, and they're losing their generational wealth they might have had in their country, right? They might have had homes. They might have had bank accounts. They might have had savings, and they had to flee for whatever reason and start over from scratch. You might have heard of refugees who say they have a degree in a certain profession, whether that be law, medicine, journalism. They might have had a profession back home, but that certification doesn't work here. So then they have to kind of restart in that way too. They lost their social capital, they lost their education, and what it means here is different. And additionally, watching their children lose their connection to their home country's origin and language, right? If they come here, particularly with very young children, they tend to learn English much faster than the parents do. And they might start to forget certain things about their home country, and that can feel really traumatizing to a family too, that they are now, living with a child who's being mainly raised in this United States dynamic. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so those are a bunch of different terms and this exploration of privileges, but upon arrival to the United States, the refugees then meet a variety of people with various titles, purposes, and roles, right? It's very all of a sudden that they get here and they meet all these people with different roles and they're introducing themselves. So you have case managers who are looking over their case, ensuring they are signed up for public benefits that help with very basic need things: food, healthcare, cash assistance, and then additionally, they have volunteers who are providing all different types of activities: transportation, cultural orientation, explaining the customs and traditions of the United States, introducing refugees to other members, right? So they're helping them build that social capital when they're working with them and helping them access different opportunities. So these are two groups of people who are really helping the refugee in some of these very basic need ways. And this is where we start to see some of that power dynamic come, and whether we mean it or not, they realize that these volunteers and these case managers have a lot that they can help me with, right? I don't want to upset them. I don't want to say no to them, right? Because they might not know what the difference is between like a friend, like if you're a friend versus a volunteer. Are you going to stop working with me if I have issues? Those types of things, right? Those kinds of questions that they may not feel comfortable asking just yet. Yeah, next slide. Thanks. So again, navigating these power dynamics. So whether you realize it or not, refugees may look to you as an authority figure and feel uncomfortable saying no to your suggestions. Culturally, it might be considered rude to say no or offer a differing opinion. You might realize that you ask them, do you want to do this? And they just say yes, and it doesn't look like maybe they're thinking about it. So we might want to check in again. This is what this is going to be. Does that sound like something you want? Or did you have another idea? Like kind of leaving it open to them. And if they still say yes, then you can kind of take them through that, but always making sure that they understand that you want what they want. And again, we talked about this just before, but if there are children in the family, they may begin to pick up English faster than the parents, and then the kids start talking to you and translating for the parents, and that can feel very uncomfortable for the parents, of course, but also for the child. right? Putting them in a position that maybe they don't want to be in, where they're having to translate for their parent. So beyond that, trauma also has a huge impact on feelings of control, not just this cultural dynamic of not maybe wanting to say no, or feeling that volunteers and case managers have more power and authority to them, because they do, right? They have these connections in the United States. They know how to get connected to things, but also trauma impacts how someone might perceive their own power. Next slide. One thing to keep in mind is that it's always really the tenet of everything we're talking about should be that the newcomers we work with are the experts of their own lives. We might be the experts of like the United States systems and education and employment and those types of things, what there is to do around the area, but they're the experts in figuring out what they want to do with those options and what they want to do in each of those systems. Next slide. So trauma can result in a loss of someone's internal locus of control. It's this kind of underlying impact of trauma, right? And we can assume that a lot of the refugees have experienced some sort of trauma. In fact, we can guarantee probably 99.9% of them have undergone some sort of trauma, whether that's losing their family members, getting separated, having to leave their home country, living in a refugee camp, dealing with war, dealing with the persecution that is involved with being a refugee. For some reason, they're being persecuted against, whether it's for their gender identity, their nationality, their race, anything of that nature, political association. But victims feel powerless when this is happening, right? This is, again, out of their control. The same way privilege is out of our control, trauma and things like this are way out of these victims or refugees' control. Right? And so they start to lose trust, maybe in themselves, to make decisions in their lives because they haven't been able to make a lot of decisions. Right? So when that's been taken away from you over and over again, and you finally get the chance to make decisions, it might feel odd. It might feel uncomfortable. It might feel uncertain, and they might need a lot of affirmation to say, yeah, let's try the thing you're talking about. So just keeping that in mind as well. Next slide. So trauma-informed principles, if you can remember these as well, even just one or two, that's great. Safety, trustworthiness, choice is a big one, collaboration, and empowerment. So all things, again, you don't need to be a social worker or therapist to know how to kind of work with some of these things. You can always make someone feel safe just by having open body language, telling them it's okay to choose what they'd like. You build trustworthiness over time, just like in any other relationship, right? And you'd want to collaborate on things with your friends and your family, on things to do, and their decisions. So you want to give the same to the refugee. Next slide. So also just pausing for some reflection on your own is, what is our opinion or thoughts of asking refugees about their personal experience fleeing their country? Is it ever appropriate? You can click. So the answer is no. We don't want to ask refugees what their personal experience was like, right? This is where some of that white saviorism could come back in, or where we're kind of, we're making them seem exotic, right? That their experience was exotic. Oh, can you tell me what that was like? That must have been so hard, right? We don't really need to know all that information because we're not their mental health care provider. If they do choose to share, that's great. You can use those trauma-informed care principles we just talked about, but really you want to prevent any instances of upsetting or re-traumatizing the family by asking about that experience of displacement. So just keeping that in mind as well. Next slide. And these are just different ways that trauma or mental health challenges show up in the daily interactions with the refugees we work with. So things like feeling or looking very anxious, asking repetitive questions about documents, services, other concerns, being startled by loud noises or voices. There could be a lack of food or an unkept home. Lack of focus is a big one. Being unable to remember dates, times of appointments, excessive sleeping. So all of these things just to look out for, right? And making sure we're still offering choices when we can, that we're being patient when we can. It's just important to remember that these refugees came here and they're excited to be here, but they're also dealing with a lot of trauma, whether or not they've told you about it, whether or not, yeah, you're aware of what they've gone through. Next slide. So we're going to go through some scenarios because I know that usually helps the best now that you're equipped with some terms. Is you visit the family's home to take the mother of the family to English class. When you arrive, she seems to have forgotten that the class is even scheduled for today. She tells you she doesn't want to go today and seems a bit distant. How would you apply the trauma-informed principles to this situation? So you can think about it on your own for a little, but for the sake of time, we're going to go to the next slide. First, what's really good to do before you think about what you're going to do is how might you be feeling, right? Because this also impacts you when you're working with refugees. You're going to have your own feelings and thoughts about some of these things. You might be frustrated that you drove out there to bring her to the appointment and she won't go. You're concerned that she's going to miss out on this opportunity to strengthen her English. Confused as to why last week she seemed so excited and now she seems disinterested. And you might be tempted to make the choice for her and push her to come along, right? So it's really good to also keep in mind and be mindful of your own feelings about these experiences and wonder, am I making this suggestion because I think it's a good idea, or am I making this suggestion based off what this person looks like they need? What do they need right now? What are they telling me with their body language, with their words? And I need to take them at that, right? Next slide. So really what we want to do when we're walking alongside newcomers as they begin to build their life is be able to, especially in that scenario with the mother, is be able to say, it looks like you're really not in the mood to go today. I really think it would be great for you to learn English and you were so excited about it last week and I don't want you to lose that excitement. But if you really don't want to go, we can always revisit this next week. And if, you'd like to talk about anything or you're not feeling well, I can connect you with someone who you can talk with about those things, right? So we've given the choice back to her. She might feel comfortable opening up. She might say, you know what, I just slept in and I forgot. Like there could be a lot of things. She might be embarrassed that she forgot and just wants to leave it alone. Or she might be feeling really unwell that day. We don't know. But the point is we can't push people into making those decisions. Next slide. Yeah. So it's important just to manage your own expectations and prepare for a variety of emotions, right? It takes a very long time for a refugee to become self-sufficient and get accustomed to an entirely new culture with its own customs, languages, and traditions. And the family might struggle with a few things by the end of your professional or volunteer experience, but that's normal and to be expected. Really, that first initial, if you're working with a refugee who's going through the RNP program, reception and placement, it's only 90 days. That's not a lot of time to learn an entire language, become comfortable with all the systems that are introduced to them, right? It's okay if people are still struggling a little bit. And the family might make choices that you disagree with or that you can see has negative consequences. And we're going to talk about some practical ways on how to deal with those feelings. Next slide. So we can't undo all the systemic oppression. So when we think about the justice slide or that in the equity continuum, we can't just get rid of racism and all these things that impact refugees, but we can build someone's sense of personal power by providing them choices. That's the biggest thing through this is providing someone choices and letting them know that they have control, right? We're affirming their autonomy. That means we ask open-ended questions like, what would you like to do today? If they say they don't know, then we can offer choices. But even when we offer choices, that might be limiting them to one or the other, right? So initially, we're asking open-ended questions. We're not asking, do you feel happy or sad? We're asking, how are you feeling today? And letting them kind of fill in the blank. showing interest in their ideas and goals, right? We might come in and have a lot of ideas. We might have done a lot of research on things that they could do for work, but they might have their own ideas. And they may not want to disappoint you if they've heard that you have all these ideas. So we want to make sure that we can listen to them first. What are you interested in for work? And even if it sounds unattainable, like something like being a baker. Oh, I was a baker at home. We don't want to shut that down immediately, right? Just because we are trying to be protective and saying, well, that might not be a reality. What we can say is, that's a great goal. I really want to work on that with you. Let's look at some options for cooking or hospitality. And then you can kind of go over some of the practicalities of finding a first job, but not discouraging it at the beginning. And not offering unsolicited advice. And even when advice is asked for, you might want to ask their thoughts and opinions first, right? So they might say, what would you do, right? Out of nervousness, you know, you're an American, you've been here. What would you do in this situation? You might say, well, what do you want to do? Can we look at that first? And then have some suggestions later on, right? Like having them start to think through the things they do want. Next slide. Okay, so this is a pretty common scenario. Spent a lot of time researching different schooling options for the eldest son in the family you're working with, and you found a great workforce development program as well as a GED program for him to go to. Right as you're about to tell him about these opportunities, he informs you he's going to work with his dad instead at the local grocery store. Next slide. So again, thinking about what we're thinking about, you might be frustrated because you spent a lot of time researching these different opportunities. He might have told you originally he wanted to go, concerned that he's not going to receive a proper education for a job that's more fulfilling for him later on. And you might be worried his parents may have pushed him into this decision. Next slide. So how do I guide a mentor without making choices? So here we're going to go through step by step. You're going to provide choices and options. I hear you're interested in going back to school, right? This is originally when they told you they want to go. Here are a few dates that this program is open and accepting applications. They have daytime and nighttime schedules, right? So even if they want to go to school, we're not just picking the first thing we see and say, okay, you're going to go in the daytime. No, you know, we're going to ask, what's a good time for you? We're going to involve them in the process. Maybe they can't fill out the application, but they can watch you do it and submit it, and you can explain to them throughout while you're applying what it looks like generally. Next, yeah. Show curiosity instead of judgment. Okay, so once they've told you that they're going to do something different, we can ask, I heard you're choosing to work instead of going back to school. Can I ask what helped you make that decision, right? So that's not judgment. Judgment would be a little bit more like, why are you doing that, right? With a certain tone versus, oh, I heard you're doing this. I'm curious. Tell me more. What does that mean to you? So it doesn't mean just accepting things point blank, but it's offering this reflective discussion. And what you can do, right, is explain the positive and negative consequences of different options. You know, it sounds like you're contributing to your family income is really important to you. That's good to know. I know we talked about you wanting to be a math teacher one day. I just want you to know to reach that goal, you will eventually need to go back to school. And then the last step is really leaving the door open for them to reach back out if needed. I'm glad you made this decision for yourself. If you ever want to talk about going back to school, I'm here for you. Now let's talk about things to keep in mind when going to work in the US. So we've done our due diligence, right? We heard what they wanted, provided options, heard they made a different decision, asked what they thought about it, and we left the door open if they'd like to come back, right? Because a lot of these things are not permanent decisions. They're just momentary decisions that make sense for the family in that moment. Next slide. Right. And so that's it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for such a great presentation. So this is now our time to answer your questions. Please, as a reminder, you can still submit your questions in the questions box if you have any questions. Emily, yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I feel like there is a very fine line between empowering and parenting. right? So these are such great examples, and they can feel frustrating sometimes when the person works so hard to get and gather all of these resources, but taking a step back, as you said, and just, how do I feel first? And realizing that refugees ended up here in the States because of their advocacy for themselves. They were having that voice. And so recognizing that and empowering that, spending more time teaching skills rather than, doing it yourself. So please keep, if you have any questions, please do submit your questions. And Emily, this time, as we wait for some questions to come, if you have any further thoughts that you would like to leave our audience with, that would be the time for that.
I guess the only thing is just going back, I think I said in the very beginning, is the idea is not perfection. Like, we don't expect to have relationships that don't have mistakes. That would be unrealistic. We don't expect that at all, and I wouldn't expect that of anyone, regardless of their professional status. We make mistakes, we might assume things. Have self-compassion, right? These are just these are not conversations to make you feel bad or make you think about all the things you've done wrong, right? This is just an opportunity for reflection. And some of you might be like, oh, I have been doing some of those things. And some of you might be like, oh, I've noticed that maybe I kind of jumped too quickly to making a decision with someone. And that's okay. And when you do make mistakes, because they will happen, I've made them, my colleagues have made them, that you have self-compassion, that you know that you're not alone, you're here trying to do the good work. And so that's really all. It's like, thanks just for being here, and also just like giving yourself that self-compassion when you do make a mistake, or yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. All right. Well, we want to thank everyone who attended today's session, and would like to hear back from you and receive your feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. So if you can take just a minute to scan the QR code on the screen to finish the survey, and we will just, please, if you have any topics, please do let us know so we can follow up with that and make sure that we are delivering those topics to you. You can also find the link for the survey in the chat, so you can complete the survey this way as well. Again, Emily, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and we wish you a great rest of your week.